We have all seen the ownership charts of how hundreds of car, confectionery, beverage, and tech brands just seem to be held by only a handful of holding companies. And so it's a reasonable assumption that this may be the case for your favorite tool brand as well. And if you have made this assumption, you would be correct. And so when you're walking around Bunnings, Home Timber and Hardware, Mitre 10, or your local independent hardware retailer, it can be very overwhelming just to see the numerous brands that are just everywhere. But when you trace back their ownership structures, you'll find that they're pretty much all held by a small conglomerate of holding companies. And so in this video, I'm going to be explaining who owns your favorite tool company, and then also explain where the dollars that you spend on these tools ends up, as in what country the ownership is in. But in order to be able to explain this, I need to go over a couple of concepts. And so they are OEMs and ODMs. And so OEM stands for Original Equipment Manufacturer. And to put it really simply, these are companies that own factories that are usually based in China, but sometimes Vietnam. And they receive the designs from these tool companies, and then they produce them en masse according to the tool company's specs. It's beneficial for the tool company because it really lowers the cost of mass producing the tool. And this can be pretty handy if you're launching a new type of tool and you're not really sure how the market is going to respond to it. It really lowers the risk of implementing a new design. And so a good metaphor for tool company using an OEM is that you might like a YouTube video before subscribing to the YouTube channel before you're 100% sure if you're finding this video informative and useful. It's obviously a great deal for the tool company, but what's in it for the OEMs? Well, yes, they do have the risk of building the factory for a product that may potentially flop, but the upside though is that they can do this for multiple clients. And then with economies of scale, they can actually produce a tool for a much lower cost than any company that's trying to build a tool on their own. And so that's an OEM. Now, what about an ODM? Well, that stands for Original Design Manufacturer. So this is a very similar concept, except this is basically a team of engineers who specialize in designing tools. But however, what you find with ODMs though, is that the majority of them use tool patents and tool concepts that are now in the public domain due to expired patents or for things that were never patented in the first place. And so that's why you find that ODMs are very commonly used for cheaper tool brands. And so now that all of that is explained, we can actually move on to the interesting part of this video, being who owns what and how. We'll talk about the biggest conglomerate first, and that is Tektronix Industries. And so they're based in Hong Kong and are founded in 1985. Now, this is an industry giant that employs 22,000 people, and they own Milwaukee, AEG, Kango, Vax, Dirt Devil, and they have the exclusive licensing rights for Ryobi tools. And so the reason why they license rather than own Ryobi is that the Ryobi business actually has several components to it, including automotive die casting and a few other things as well. And so to keep things really simple, they basically just sold the exclusive licensing rights to Tektronix Industries. And so just to keep things simple, although they don't officially own Ryobi tools, they pretty much run and own everything that Ryobi tools does. And so Tektronix Industries are themselves an OEM. Over time, they actually started to buy their customers. And so in regards to whether all of these brands use OEMs or not, well, Milwaukee, Ryobi, AEG, Kango, Vax, and Dirt Devil don't use an OEM because they are an OEM. And so, do they use ODMs? Well, they don't use them either, because Tektronix Industries actually has their own team of tool designers and engineers. And so the same design team will create the designs for all of these brands, and they could potentially use the same patents, battery management systems, gearing, and brushless motors for all of the brands. However, a point of difference, however, though, might be is that when the Ryobi and AEG designs, for example, they might use plastic housings for a component, whereas Milwaukee might use an aluminium alloy, for example, which is a bit more expensive but also longer lasting. And so I think a good metaphor to use for this is to say that it's similar to the difference between Lexus and Toyota. Now we'll move on to a second big conglomerate, and that is Stanley Black & Decker, or SBD. This is an all-American owned conglomerate, and I can't really give you a founding date. This company is a bit of a soup of several companies that have merged together over the years. Anyway, SBD, they own Stanley, Black & Decker, DeWalt, Craftsman, and Irwin. they like to keep a relatively very tight control over their manufacturing process for their expensive tools. And they only really use OEMs for the entry-level tools for the brands like Craftsman or Black & Decker. And although the conglomerate is owned in the United States, they do actually directly own factories in China, Mexico, Brazil, and the Czech Republic. And so this company really does have an ideology of directly owning the factories rather than outsourcing to OEMs. Now, SBD did recently have a very strong and legitimate attempt to reshore all of their production back to the United States, and they committed to a $90 million plant to be built in Texas. But despite their best efforts, the whole operation failed, as they could not produce the tools for anywhere near the costings of what their overseas factories could. And it was shut down in 2023. And so this $90 million factory is now sitting empty. SBD just is already well too aware that reshoring is not economically feasible. And so with them not wanting to offshore, and with them knowing that reshoring is not economically viable, they're now attempting a third strategy known as friendshoring. And this is basically a process where you build your factories in countries of low geopolitical risk. And so in this Stanley Black & Decker's case, they're choosing Mexico. Alrighty, so now I'll move on to the next conglomerate, and that is Einhell AG. And that was founded in 1964, and they're based in Germany. And so they sell Einhell in Europe, and in Australia and New Zealand, they sell Ozito. And so yes, Ozito was started off in Australia in 1993 in Melbourne, but it was sold to Einhell in 2016. And so similar to Black & Decker, Einhell do actually produce the majority of their tools in their own factories, and these factories are usually based in the Czech Republic. With that being said, they do use OEMs and they do use ODMs, and they especially do this for their entry-level tools. And given that Ozito is primarily entry-level tool designs, it's a very fair assumption to say that a lot of these Ozito tools, especially the ones behind me, are very highly likely made in a Chinese or Vietnamese OEM, even though the headquarters of this company is based in Germany. And so that is why we get such good value for money when using Ozito. Alrighty, so now we'll move on to the next conglomerate, and that is Koki, and they're started in 1918, and they're based in Japan. And yes, I know they're started in Germany, but they were sold to Japanese investors in 2016. Now, they have the brands Metabo and Hikoki, and Hikoki was originally known as Hitachi. Now, they surprisingly don't really utilize OEMs or ODMs that much, and that is especially the case for the tools sold in Europe. However, for the tools that are sold in Oceania, including Australia, they do occasionally use OEMs. And so with Metabo, if you're buying it in Australia, chances are that it is using an OEM. And if you're buying it in Europe, chances are that it was made in a directly owned factory. Alrighty, and so now that brings me on to the last category of ownership, and that is every other tool brand. And yes, there's several to get through, so I've just lumped them into one big group. Tool companies that I'm about to mention haven't really merged or taken over anyone else, and they're all still standalone tool companies. And so Bosch, Makita, Karcher, and Chevron, who own Ego, and Nick Fish, who own Gurney, all still have their own factories, and very rarely use OEMs for their key products. When I say that they're all their own companies, I should mention that Bosch does own 350 subsidiaries, except those subsidiaries in other industries. And so, although they're a standalone tool company, Bosch are actually quite a giant business conglomerate. So that's pretty much how the tool company ownership structure is as of the middle of 2025. However, what is the future likely to bring as far as who owns what tool brands? Well, a couple of industry changes that are starting to creep in is that Chinese OEMs and ODMs are trying to sell directly to the public now instead of going through a client tool company. And the tools are literally made in the same factory as what some of the tools from your favorite company come from. However, the downside about buying these tools directly from the OEM or the ODM though, is that they usually have a different battery ecosystem to what your favorite tool brand does. And so that's China. Meanwhile, in the United States, the current US political administration is trying to reshore all of its production. However, the US private sector is very much aware that this is just not feasible. And the most likely course of action is just to wait out the current US administration and then ramp up production overseas again when and if that term ever finishes. Because there's a high probability that they could go down the route that Stanley Black & Decker did, where you spend a small fortune on making a domestic factory just to find that it won't be needed in 3 years. And as for the rest of the world, well, everyone's become more and more aware of the political risk of offshoring. And it's likely that we'll follow the Stanley Black & Decker example of trying to friendshore, where the tools would still be cheaper than making the tools domestically, but they'll be more expensive than producing the tools in China as well. And so countries like Malaysia, Vietnam, the Czech Republic, Mexico, and Brazil are highly likely to benefit from this. Anyway, I really hope this answered your curiosity about who owns what tool company, and as per usual, thanks for watching.